The big news in sports media, F1 likely headed to Apple TV. The reports are around $150 million annually. So we're going to bring in at the top our motorsports maven, Adam Stern, to talk about what he's hearing. Adam, thank you for coming on the pod.
Thank you.
So, Adam, how surprised were you at the $150 million a year figure that Apple is reportedly offering?
Yeah, it's definitely somewhat of a surprise. Let's take a step back. Liberty Media bought F1. They agreed to buy it in 2016 from CVC Capital Partners. The deal closed in 2017. By the end of 2017, they were negotiating a deal with ESPN to move to their network from NBC Sports. So pretty much the whole rise of F1 in the Liberty Media era has happened with ESPN. We know that they're kind of seen as like the gateway into sports in America. And so the idea that they could be moving away from them finally is certainly surprising to a certain degree. It's certainly a very big deal, but we also have known for months that this could possibly be coming. It was basically around the Super Bowl when we started hearing that F1 was hearing from ESPN that they weren't necessarily going to get the increase that they were looking for, that ESPN was telling them to go to the market and see what they could get instead. So we knew that this was a possibility, but the idea that Apple could get it exclusively and that there's not going to be any events that are still on linear, that is somewhat surprising. I mean, even when you look at MLS, they were able to work out a deal where they're largely on Apple TV, but they still have around 15 games that are on linear TV. So it is somewhat surprising to think that F1 could disappear entirely from the linear spectrum in America. They've been trying to grow. Obviously, they've had that Drive to Survive effect in 2020. They've been looking for those next catalysts. F1, the movie, has somewhat been that for them, it seems like, potentially. That's in partnership with Apple, so obviously they're a deep partner of Apple at this point. But it's fascinating. For F1, it's always been a little bit more than just about linear TV ratings in America. They care about how they really have a huge grip on Madison Avenue and a huge grip on Hollywood and a huge grip on Silicon Valley. And so this is all that kind of culminating together where this great linear player, which obviously has a digital presence as well, with ESPN is kind of saying, hey, we're going to focus on fiscal discipline. We're not as worried about keeping F1. And here's a new player from the streaming age with Apple, huge tech company that's stepping in to fill the void.
Adam, to that point, do you think a deal with Apple would hurt F1's visibility in the U.S.?
I think to a certain degree, if you look at history as a guide and we're looking at MLS, it seems like to a certain degree it would right now. We don't know the exact subscribers for Apple TV, but it's believed to be in the mid 8 figures, so like 40 million people, 50 million subscribers, somewhere around that. That's obviously a lot less than Netflix, a lot less than Prime Video. Of course, linear TV retains a mid 8-figure number of cable subscribers. And so there's obviously a loss, I think, of exposure there for sure. Again, ESPN is kind of that gateway. It's a big deal if you don't have your rights with them from like a Sports Center perspective. We remember when the NHL aligned back with ESPN and Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL, said, if ESPN promotes us half as well as they froze us out when they didn't have our rights, this is going to be fantastic. So presumably, you're going to see things like ESPN caring less about covering F1 during Sports Center and things like that. So it does seem like it would be a potential loss of exposure. From F1's perspective, they're willing to take a bet with a company like Apple, one of the biggest, richest companies in the world, one of the most technologically savvy companies in the world that not only has this media platform, but also is the maker of the iPhone and all these other things.
F1 race is getting around 1.3 million viewers per race this season. That's going to go to we don't know in the next season because Apple doesn't release the numbers. We haven't had any numbers from any MLS games or just about anything coming out of there. I think it definitely hurts the visibility there, not knowing how many people are going to be watching that. Adam, this feels like, and you've discussed it a little bit, it's more than a straight race telecast deal. So what are some of the other things that Apple could do here to really merge this sort of deal alongside their consumer products division?
Well, we've seen the playbook a little bit already with F1 the movie, with all the different things they've done. They integrated F1 into new ways in Apple Maps, and they brought Brad Pitt into Apple stores to talk along Tim Cook. And obviously he was the lead actor in F1 the movie. There's things they could do around AI. There's things they could do with their hardware, with iPhones. Of course, Apple at one point looked into trying to build a car. Now, obviously, F1 themselves don't build cars, but they're partners with all of these companies that do. So it seems like this is possibly a much bigger play than just media rights. I presume that's probably how Apple and Tim Cook and Eddie Q are selling it. We know Eddie Q is on the Ferrari board of directors, so he's a huge fan of F1 already. So, things like that always help. When you have someone who's very influential at a company and he's a fan of something, sometimes that can play a part in a company wanting to take a bet on something. But look, the F1 the movie has been a huge success so far. Largely, it's approaching 400 million. Last count, according to Box Office Mojo from IMDb, was yesterday at 395 million. So getting ready to eclipse 400 million. That's in and around where they'll start to profit from that movie. Cost 250 million to produce and 100 to 150 million to market. They also have to split some of the money with the box offices. So they're getting towards the range of where they're going to profit on F1 the movie. And on top of that, it's already been the most successful Apple movie ever. It was Brad Pitt's biggest movie opening ever. So they got to kind of experience and see the power of F1. And it seems like that has led to them taking this leap on this bid. And yeah, I do expect it to be larger than just a media deal. That's how it's kind of been described to me from some people familiar with the matter, is that F1 doesn't just see this as a media rights deal.
The coolest integration for me, F1 and Apple, was that trailer they released right before the movie came out. It was haptic. It shook in your hand as you're watching the trailer. I thought that was very innovative and very cool stuff that they were able to do.
That's a great example.
That freaked me out. I didn't like it. But many prior F1 deals have been short, like we're talking around 3 years. But MLS and Apple did a 10-year deal. How long do you think this deal could be for?
I haven't heard the number yet. I would be hesitant to think that F1 is going to accept a very long-term deal guaranteed for 10 years. I would think that they'll probably look to something similar, like 3 years guaranteed, maybe 5 years guaranteed, but even that would be quite a while, I would think. So we'll have to see what comes out there, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's something like a 3+2 or something along those lines. But it's possible that Apple is going to demand a longer-term deal. Who knows, though? Maybe Apple is okay with short-term deals, too. It's hard to say without having talked to those principal players exactly what they're looking for. Tim Cook hasn't spoken publicly about this yet, about those media rights. So we'll see what ends up being said. Stefano Domenicali, the same. The F1 CEO hasn't really revealed exactly what they're looking for lengthwise, but I certainly would probably lean towards shorter than 10 years. But I could end up being wrong about that. We'll have to see.
All right, Adam, we're going to have you put on your movie critic hat. What is the better film in your eyes, F1 or Days of Thunder?
Different strokes for different folks. I'm going to go to what Steve Phelps said this week in an interview with Puck, where he said that they're just different series. And certainly I think from a camera perspective, the advancement of the technology, certainly F1 the movie was much more advanced, but it came out 30 plus years later. So that would be expected. For some people, I think Days of Thunder will always be their favorite, but they're probably more NASCAR fans. We're going to see what happens next. NASCAR and Jerry Bruckheimer Films, NASCAR Holdings. NASCAR owns IMSA, the sports car property that was in F1 the movie. They have a very close relationship with Jerry Bruckheimer Films, and it seems like they're in talks with Tom Cruise to possibly do a Days of Thunder reboot. So I think that's something very much to look out for. And Kaczynski, who was involved with the F1 the movie, he suggested maybe they could do a sequel where we have Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt come together with both their characters from Days of Thunder and F1 the movie. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes, what's next, but I'm not going to be drawn in on picking one.
Sonny Hayes and Cole Trickle in the same movie? I don't know if I can handle that.
All right, Adam, let's jump over to UFC. Does something like a White House lawn fight make it more likely that Netflix goes harder after those rights?
I think definitely. I think that's exactly the sort of thing that Netflix is looking for. We had heard that possibly Netflix could be involved in bidding on F1. Maybe they did make a bid, but it didn't really come to pass, it appears. And one of the reasons is like F1 is a long season, and to take all of their rights, that doesn't seem like something that was appealing to Netflix. Netflix is more focused on these big tentpole events, Jake Paul, Mike Tyson, things like that. Last year, UFC had an event at the Sphere. It cost them like $20 million to put it on when it usually only costs like $1 million to put on an event, or maybe even less. So it was like 20 times more expensive than usual. Therefore, Dana White said they're pretty much never doing it again. But they've been looking for their next big thing as a result. An event at the White House. It's huge, in part because the location is such a big deal that you've had people like Conor McGregor and John Jones, two of the biggest draws ever in UFC history, basically say that they're looking at coming out of retirement to be part of this event. So this appears to be right up Netflix's alley. Dana White was on a podcast recently where he basically hinted that the next platform they're going to be on is going to be a lot more global than the current one they're on. So That kind of sounds like Netflix. Obviously, they're already working with Netflix with their boxing platform for an upcoming fight in September with Canelo Alvarez and Terrence Crawford at Allegiant Stadium. So, of course, we know they're already close with Netflix. So, yeah, it seems right up their alley, but we'll have to see, similar to the F1 situation. Does UFC bifurcate and end up with two different partners? It seems like, to me, like that was certainly something they were deeply evaluating, was keeping a part of their next package with ESPN. So we'll have to see what happens there, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're able to bifurcate those rights and keep part of their package with ESPN and also do some with Netflix and possibly like a gigantic event, apparently, like the White House UFC card.
Well, Adam, you read my mind. Like with ESPN not spending these dollars on F1 and with this direct-to-consumer product coming out, do you think it puts ESPN in a better position now to keep UFC rights?
Definitely. It would be, almost $100 million saved that they can spend elsewhere, simply put. So you would imagine that it would help their efforts. And of course, we know they're spending a lot of money on a lot of other properties and even talent that they've been spending increased amounts for. So who knows exactly? We'll have to see what gets finished, what gets reported and confirmed. But it certainly seems like that could help them. If they're saving money here, they could spend it elsewhere.
Well, Adam Stern, our man covering anything with wheels or fists. We appreciate you coming on the pod this week.
You got it.